Yo, what's going on YouTube? It's your boy Captain Skrull. In today's video, we are going to talk about the PvP changes that are going to be dropping on November 21st, which is Tuesday, which is tomorrow. There are some big nerfs and there are some buffs to classes that are underperforming, and we're going to go through the patch notes and talk about it. But your boy's Spec MM is getting a huge nerf and a 4-set nerf before anybody even has 4-set. So we're going to talk deeply about Marksman and the other changes in PvP and what we think and how the meta is going to change. So let's get right into the video. All right, so Blizzard said, we've looked at the data and feedback from players over the first week of Season 3 PvP and intend to make some adjustments. We're schedule weekly maintenance to address a few classes where we're seeing over and underperformance. This is for PvP only, right? So DK, Unholy. Death Coil damage is now increased by 70% in PvP combat, was 90%. So that's going to be a 20% nerf, which is really good because I think Unholy was pretty much A+ tier or S tier, right, with the Death Coil buff damage. And their most damage every time on the charts was Death Coil. So that's a pretty good nerf for Unholy DKs. And the huge, and thank God, nerf for Demon Hunter Havoc. They were just absurd. They represented most of the ladder. They were just absolutely mongoing people. And you couldn't do anything to get them off you. They just did so much damage. So inertia damage bonus reduced to 12%, was 18% in PvP combat, so that's a 6% nerf. Decree damage reduced by 20% in PvP combat, nice. The hunt initial and periodic damage reduced by 30%, was 20% in PvP combat. Throw-glaive damage reduced by 10% in PvP combat. Essence break damage bonus reduced by 50%, was 65% in PvP combat. Veil Barrage damage reduced by 20% in PvP combat. So some big nerfs to have a Demon Hunter, which is necessary. They were just absurd. They were doing so much damage and it was impossible to get them off you. Alright, Druid, Resto, Life Bloom periodic healing decreased by 12% in PvP combat. That makes sense because Resto was like definitely a top 2 healer compared to like Disc Priest. They were up there. Grove Guardian's nourishing healing decreased by 15% in PvP combat. And Grove Guardian's health decreased by 66%. So that's some big nerfs for Resto Druid. Hunter, Marksman, the big one, my main. Rapid fire damage increased by 20%, was 40% in PvP combat. So that is a 20% nerf to rapid fire. Before we even have our 4-set, they're nerfing rapid fire. So basically, the 20% damage in your 2-set is basically going to make up for this damage. But you're going to lose damage because if you had the 40% plus your 2-set, obviously it's 60% additional damage. So now it's only going to be 40. Now, Guardians of the Dream 4-piece set piece now causes your next rapid fire to fire 40% additional bolts, was 60 in PvP. That's a 20% nerf before anybody even has it. So here's a little buff, which I think is good. Arcane shot damage increased by 35%, was 25% in PvP combat. So that's a 10% buff. And Chimera shot damage increased by 35%, 25% in PvP combat. I don't know if you want to run a Chimera shot over, like you just want Arcane shot. Maybe you want to because it shoots 2, but I highly doubt it. But we'll just have to see on Tuesday and see if it's a good talent to actually run for Marksmanship hunters. Let's move on. Paladin Holy, mana regeneration now decreased by 25%, was 55% in PvP combat. So that's saying their mana regeneration is going to be buffed in PvP now. So that's good for them because yeah, they're really lacking compared to Resto Druid and Disc Priest. Priest Shadow increased damage of all abilities by 8% in PvP combat. So Shadow Priest coming in with a big buff to all their abilities. Mind Trauma's duration reduced by 15 seconds. Excuse me, reduced to 15 seconds, was 20 seconds. Mage, so it looks like Mage, all 3 specs are getting some changes. Last wave now, Snares, 50% for 6 seconds, was 70% in PvP combat, so that's a 20% nerf. Arcane, so that's just mages in general. Chrono Shift now increases movement speed by 25%, was 50%, so that's a 25% nerf. Temporal Shield now heals for 60% of damage taken over 4 seconds, was 100% in PvP combat, so that's a 40% nerf. So Arcane taking some big nerfs. Interesting. Very interesting. Fire. Ignite damage increased by 20% in PvP combat. Fireball damage increased by 30%, was 12%, so that's a huge buff. Scorch damage increased by 100%, was 45%. This talent Glass Cannon PvP talent now increases the damage of Ignite, Fireball, and Scorch by 40%, was 100%, and decreases maximum health by 15%, was 20%. So they're making it so it doesn't take as much health, and they're also nerfing how much damage it gives because they're just buffing these abilities in general. So that talent's getting a little change, but the abilities themselves are being buffed overall, which is good. for fire mage because they're kind of lacking right now, right? Frost, flurry damage increased by 20%, was 8% in PvP combat, so there's a 12% buff for you. Frozen orb damage increased by 75%, was 30% in PvP combat. That's a huge buff. Frostbomb PvP talent, damage increased by 80%, so that's huge. Ice Lance damage increased by 35%, was 15% in PvP combat, so there's another big buff. Comet Storm damage increased by 40%, was 15% in PvP combat. Freezing Winds now grants Fingers of Frost every 5 seconds, was 3 seconds, so there's a little nerf in PvP combat. Frozen Orb damage now has a 5% chance to grant Fingers of Frost, was 10% in PvP combat, so there's another little nerf, but there's some big damage buff to the abilities overall, so I think Frost Mage is probably going to be the best mage spec, it's looking like. Fire might actually be similar too. They're both getting huge buff, so I think Arcane's going to fall behind once again in the mage specs, so we'll have to see on Tuesday in the coming weeks to see how they perform. Monk Mistweaver, Rising Sun Kick damage increased by 36%, was 20% PvP combat. Blackout Kick, Teaching of the Monastery, damage decreased by 25% in PvP combat. Tiger Palm damage decreased by 20% PvP combat. Ancient Teachings now transfers 275% of damage done, was 220% in PvP combat. So there's some nerfs and buffs to Mistweaver damage. I assume it's to mitigate Fistweaver and how strong it can be, especially running with like Warrior. Rogue Assassination, King, Bane, initial and periodic damage now reduced by 20%, was 11% in PvP combat, so there's a 9% nerf. Outlaw Crackshock now causes Between the Eyes to dispatch the target for 50%, was 75% of normal damage when used from stealth, so there's a nerf. Subtlety, Perforator Veins damage bonus reduced to 40%, was 50% in PvP combat, so there's a 10% buff. Gormor's Bite, damage reduced by 10% in PvP combat, so there's a 10% nerf. And finally, Shaman Elemental, Lightning Bolt now deals 67% increased damage in PvP combat, was 45%, so there's a buff. Chain Lightning deals 15% increased damage in PvP combat now, so there's a buff. Ice Fury damage is now increased by 85% in PvP combat. This is weird. They're buffing Ellie in these abilities, which probably most of their abilities are damages from Lavaverse, right? So they're just trying to buff their other abilities. Volcanic Surge now increases damage of Chain Lightning and Lightning Bolt by 30%, was 50%. So there's a 20% nerf to mitigate the changes that they're increasing Lightning Bolt and Chain Lightning damage just in general, so it doesn't rely on this Volcanic Surge. Those are the PvP changes coming on November 21st, which is Tuesday, which is tomorrow. The Marksman nerf, I don't really see. I just feel like Marksman hasn't been super overwhelming. They don't even have Force Set yet, but maybe Blizzard's thinking they're going to be super overpowered with Force Set, so they're trying to mitigate that damage now. But I just feel like Arms Warrior, Havoc DH, DK, it's just like a melee meta right now. And with those nerfs to Havoc Demon Hunter, it should be pretty helpful. But I still think Arms Warrior is pretty nuts right now. And the Marksman nerfs, I don't really see a point for it right now. But I guess they're trying to do it for the future. And we'll have to see how Marksman is. I think they're A+ tier right now. And they were going to be S tier with set. I think they're in A now. And they'll be A+ with set tier. But only time will tell. Appreciate you guys tuning into the video. If you could like, subscribe, I'd really appreciate it. And let me know in the comments what you guys think of the PvP changes that are coming tomorrow. And I will see you guys in the next one. Peace.